In the history of Christianity, there are many saints who lived holy lives, many who preached powerful sermons, and many who performed miracles. But only a few saints completely changed the way people understood the gospel. Saint Francis of Assisi was one of those rare souls. He did not found a kingdom. He did not command armies. He did not write great theological books like many church fathers. Instead, Francis did something much more radical. He walked away from everything. He left behind wealth, comfort, reputation, and the promise of success in the world. He chose a life that seemed foolish to many people around him, a life of poverty, prayer, humility, and love for all creation. Yet from that decision, something extraordinary happened. His example spread across Europe. Thousands followed his way of life. The church itself was renewed. Today, more than 800 years later, Saint Francis of Assisi remains one of the most beloved saints in the world. He is remembered as the saint of peace, the friend of the poor, and the brother of all creation. But before he became the humble saint dressed in rough cloth, Francis was something very different. He was the son of a wealthy merchant, a young man who loved parties, music, and dreams of becoming a knight. His transformation did not happen overnight. It was a journey through ambition, war, illness, confusion, and finally a deep encounter with God. To understand Saint Francis, we must begin at the very beginning, in a small medieval town in Italy. Francis was born around the year 1118 or 1-2 in the town of Assisi, located in the region of Umbria in central Italy. Assisi at that time was a small but lively town built on the slopes of Mount Subasio. Narrow stone streets wound between houses, churches, and small marketplaces where merchants sold cloth, wine, olives, and grain. Francis was born into one of the most prosperous families in that town. His father, Pietro di Bernardone, was a successful cloth merchant who traveled frequently to France for business. These journeys made him wealthy, and he hoped that his son would one day inherit and expand the family trade. His mother, Picca, was a gentle and devout woman who likely influenced Francis in ways that would only become clear later in life. Originally the child was named Giovanni, but his father loved France so much that he gave him a new name, Francesco, meaning the Frenchman. No one could have imagined that this boy would one day become one of the greatest saints in Christian history. As a child, Francis lived comfortably. His father's wealth meant he never lacked anything. He wore fine clothing, enjoyed good food, and grew up surrounded by the privileges of a prosperous merchant family. But Francis was not particularly interested in business. Instead, he was drawn to music, poetry, and friendship. He loved singing with companions in the streets. He enjoyed celebrations and gatherings. He dreamed of adventure. Like many young men of his time, Francis was fascinated by the romantic ideal of knighthood. Knights represented courage, honor, and glory. They fought in battles, defended their cities, and won fame. Francis imagined himself becoming such a hero. Those who knew him as a teenager remembered him as cheerful, generous, and full of life. He was the kind of young man who easily became the center of attention. If his friends were celebrating, Francis would often pay for the festivities. If someone was in need, he would give generously. Yet beneath the joy and laughter, there was also something restless within him. He did not yet know it, but God was preparing his heart for something far greater than the life he imagined. At the beginning of the 13th century, Italian city-states frequently fought one another for power and influence. Assisi was no exception. In 921, war broke out between Assisi and the neighboring city of Perugia. For Francis, this conflict seemed like the perfect opportunity to achieve the heroic glory he had always imagined. He eagerly joined the soldiers of Assisi, hoping to prove himself on the battlefield. But the reality of war was far different from the songs and stories he had grown up hearing. The battle ended in disaster for Assisi. Many soldiers were killed, and others were captured, including Francis. He was taken prisoner and transported to Perugia, where he would remain for nearly a year. Life in prison was harsh. The conditions were poor, the future uncertain, and the dreams of knighthood that once filled his mind slowly began to fade. It was during this time that Francis began to experience the first deep cracks in the life he had been living. When he was finally released and returned home, he was not the same carefree young man. He had seen suffering. He had felt fear. He had experienced the fragility of human ambitions. Shortly after returning, Francis became seriously ill. For weeks he lay in bed recovering, forced into silence and reflection. This illness became a turning point. The things that once excited him, parties, wealth, fame, began to lose their attraction. Instead, he found himself asking questions he had never asked before. What is the meaning of life? What does God truly want from me? What kind of life is truly worth living? These questions would soon lead him toward one of the most dramatic spiritual transformations in history. After recovering from illness, Francis tried to return to his normal life, but something inside him had changed. The joy he once found in parties and celebrations no longer satisfied him. The songs he used to sing with friends suddenly felt empty. The dreams of becoming a knight no longer stirred his heart. Instead, Francis began to spend more time alone in prayer. He wandered outside the walls of Assisi, often visiting quiet places where he could think and reflect. One of those places would soon become the turning point of his life. Just outside Assisi stood a small, ruined church called San Damiano. The church was old and nearly abandoned. The walls were cracked, the roof damaged, and few people came to pray there anymore. One day Francis entered the church to pray before a large crucifix. He knelt in silence. The chapel was quiet. The only sound was the wind moving softly through the broken stones. Then something extraordinary happened. As Francis prayed before the crucifix, he suddenly heard a voice. The voice seemed to come from Christ on the cross. The words were simple, but they would change the course of history. Francis, go and repair my house, which as you see is falling into ruin. Francis was stunned. He looked around the chapel, but there was no one there. The voice had come from the crucifix itself. To Francis, the meaning seemed obvious. The church building around him was clearly falling apart. So he decided to obey the command immediately. He went home, took cloth from his father's shop, sold it, and used the money to help rebuild the church. But when his father discovered what he had done, everything exploded into conflict. Francis's father, Pietro Bernardone, was furious. The cloth that Francis sold belonged to the family business. To Pietro, his son had not only wasted valuable merchandise, but had also publicly embarrassed the family. He demanded that Francis return the money. But Francis refused. To him, the command of Christ was more important than the expectations of his father. The conflict grew so serious that the matter was brought before the Bishop of Assisi. A crowd gathered to watch. No one expected what Francis was about to do. Standing before the bishop, Francis made a decision that shocked everyone present. He removed the clothes he was wearing, clothes paid for by his father. Then he placed them on the ground. Turning to his father, he said something unforgettable. "Until now I have called Pietro Bernardone my father. But from now on I say only, Our Father who art in heaven." In that moment Francis renounced his inheritance, his wealth, and his family's security. He left the city wearing nothing but a simple garment given to him by the bishop. From that day forward, Francis chose to live in radical poverty. He begged for food. He worked repairing churches. He spent long hours in prayer. Many people thought he had gone mad. Some mocked him. Others felt pity. But Francis had discovered something powerful, a freedom that wealth had never given him. He no longer needed riches. He no longer needed reputation. He wanted only to follow Christ as closely as possible. This radical choice would soon inspire others. Within a few years, Francis would no longer be alone. For a time, Francis lived almost completely alone. He spent his days repairing broken churches around Assisi with his own hands. The three small churches most connected with this time were San Damiano, San Pietro, and the tiny chapel called Porciuncula, which would later become one of the most important places in Franciscan history. Francis worked like a simple laborer. He carried stones. He mixed mortar. He begged for materials. Often he had to ask people for food because he owned nothing. At first, the townspeople saw him as strange. Some laughed at him. Others thought he had lost his mind. But something about Francis began to attract attention. Despite his poverty, he was filled with joy. Despite his simple clothing, his eyes carried peace. Despite being mocked, he spoke gently and kindly to everyone. People noticed that Francis treated every person with dignity: the rich, the poor, the sick, and even those rejected by society. One day something happened that showed just how deeply Francis had changed. In medieval Europe, leprosy was one of the most feared diseases. Lepers were often forced to live outside towns because people were terrified of catching the illness. Before his conversion, Francis had always been afraid of them. But one day, while riding outside the city, he encountered a leper on the road. At first he felt the old fear rising in his heart. Then he remembered Christ. Instead of turning away, Francis dismounted from his horse. He approached the sick man, and he embraced him. Francis even kissed the leper's hand. Later, Francis would say that what once seemed bitter to him had suddenly become sweet. This moment symbolized the complete transformation of his heart. Soon after this, the first men began to join him. One by one they came. They were not drawn by power or wealth. Francis offered neither. They were drawn by the authenticity of his life. They saw someone living the gospel literally. Someone who trusted God completely. Someone who had discovered a freedom that wealth could never buy. The first follower was Bernardo de Quintaval, a respected and wealthy man of Assisi. After spending time observing Francis, Bernardo decided to give up his possessions and join him. Then came others. Within a short time, Francis had several companions. They lived simply. They prayed together. They preached repentance and love. But Francis had no intention of founding a powerful religious organization. He simply wanted to live the gospel. Yet what began as a small group of wandering men would soon become one of the most influential religious movements in the history of Christianity. As the number of followers increased, Francis realized they needed guidance. He wanted their way of life to remain simple and faithful to the teachings of Christ. So he created a short rule for his brothers. The rule was based almost entirely on the words of the gospel. They would live in poverty, preach repentance and peace, work when possible, beg when necessary, serve the poor, trust completely in God. They called themselves Fratres Minores, the lesser brothers. The name reflected Francis's desire that they always remain humble. They would not be powerful. They would not be important. They would be the smallest of all. In the year 1200, Francis decided to bring this rule to Rome to seek approval from the Pope. At that time, the Pope was Innocent II, one of the most powerful leaders in the Church. When Francis and his companions arrived in Rome, their appearance shocked many people. They wore rough tunics tied with rope belts. They owned nothing. They looked more like wandering beggars than members of a religious order. At first, many officials doubted them. But according to tradition, Pope Innocent II had a dream. In the dream, he saw a small poor man holding up the Lateran Basilica, the main church of Rome, which seemed ready to collapse. The Pope later believed that the man in the dream was Francis. After meeting him personally, the Pope gave approval for Francis and his companions to continue their mission. This moment officially marked the beginning of the Franciscan Order. From that moment, the movement began to grow rapidly. Men from many parts of Italy and Europe joined Francis. They traveled through towns and villages preaching repentance, peace, and the love of God. Unlike many preachers of the time, Francis spoke in a way ordinary people could understand. He did not speak like a scholar. He spoke like a brother. And people listened. Within a few years, thousands would follow the path Francis had begun. One of the most beautiful aspects of Saint Francis of Assisi's spirituality was the way he viewed the world around him. Francis did not see nature merely as scenery or resources for human use. He saw creation as a family created by God. He often referred to the sun as brother sun, the moon as sister moon, and even fire water, and the earth as brothers and sisters. For Francis, every creature reflected the love and creativity of the Creator. This perspective gave birth to one of the most famous spiritual poems in Christian history, the Canticle of the Creatures. In this prayer, Francis praises God through creation. Praise be you, my Lord, through brother sun, who brings the day and through whom you give us light. Praised be you, my Lord, through sister moon and the stars. Praised be you through brother wind, and through the air and clouds. Praised be you through sister water, so useful, humble, precious, and pure. Francis' love for creation was not sentimental. It was deeply theological. He believed that the entire universe reflected the glory of God. Because of this, he treated animals with gentleness and respect. Many stories are told about Francis speaking to birds, rescuing animals, or calming wild creatures. One of the most famous legends tells of Francis preaching to a flock of birds. As the story goes, Francis saw a large number of birds gathered in a field. He approached them and began speaking about God's love. Instead of flying away, the birds remained still, as if listening. When Francis finished speaking, he blessed them and they flew away. Whether every detail happened exactly as the stories say is not the most important point. What matters is what these stories reveal about Francis. He believed all creation belonged to God and therefore deserved respect and love. Because of this unique vision, Saint Francis is today known as the patron saint of animals and the environment. Francis' example did not only inspire men. It also transformed the life of a young woman from Assisi named Claire. Claire came from a noble family. She had grown up surrounded by wealth and comfort. But after hearing Francis preach, she felt a powerful calling to follow Christ in poverty and prayer. One night in 1022, Claire secretly left her home. She went to the little chapel of the Portiuncula, where Francis and his brothers were praying. There Francis welcomed her and cut her hair, a sign that she was dedicating her life to God. Claire would go on to found a new religious community known today as the Poor Clares. Like Francis and his brothers, the Poor Clares embraced radical poverty. They owned nothing. They trusted entirely in God's providence. Claire became one of the strongest supporters of Francis' vision. Her wisdom and courage helped protect the Franciscan movement during difficult times. Even after Francis died, Claire continued leading her community with great holiness. The friendship between Francis and Claire remains one of the most beautiful spiritual friendships in Christian history. One of the most surprising moments in Francis' life happened during the Fifth Crusade. At that time, Christians and Muslims were engaged in violent conflict in the Middle East. In 120, Francis traveled to Egypt where Christian armies were fighting Muslim forces. But Francis did not go to fight. He went to seek peace. In a bold and dangerous move, Francis crossed the battle lines and requested a meeting with the Muslim leader, Sultan al-Kamil. Many believed Francis would be executed immediately. Instead, something remarkable happened. The Sultan welcomed him. The two men spoke respectfully with one another. Francis shared his faith. The Sultan listened. Although the Sultan did not convert to Christianity, he was deeply impressed by Francis' courage and sincerity. According to tradition, the Sultan allowed Francis to leave safely. This event showed something extraordinary about Francis. He believed peace and dialogue were stronger than violence. Centuries later, this meeting is often remembered as one of the earliest examples of interreligious dialogue. One of the most mysterious events in Francis' life occurred in 1224. By this time, Francis had spent many years traveling, preaching, and guiding the growing Franciscan movement. His health had become weak. He often withdrew to quiet places for prayer. One such place was Mount La Verna in Tuscany. While praying there during a period of deep meditation on the suffering of Christ, Francis experienced something extraordinary. Witnesses later reported that he received the stigmata, the wounds of Christ. Marks appeared on his hands, feet, and side resembling the wounds Jesus received during the crucifixion. Francis became the first recorded saint in history to receive the stigmata. He tried to keep this experience hidden, but those close to him noticed the wounds and the suffering they caused. For Francis, the stigmata was not a sign of glory. It was a sign of deep union with Christ's suffering. In the last years of his life, Francis became increasingly weak. Years of travel, fasting, and illness had taken their toll. His eyesight began to fail. His body grew fragile. Yet his spirit remained joyful. Even in suffering, Francis continued praising God. It was during this time that he completed the Canticle of the Creatures, one of the most joyful spiritual songs ever written. Near the end of his life, Francis asked to be laid on the bare ground. He wanted to die in the same poverty with which he had lived. He asked his brothers to read passages from the Gospel. Then he gave them his final blessing. Saint Francis of Assisi died on October 3, 1926. He was about 44 years old. The news of his death spread quickly across Italy. People already believed he was a saint. Only 2 years later, in 2020, Pope Gregory IX officially declared him Saint Francis of Assisi. But Francis' influence did not end there. The Franciscan movement continued growing. Today, the Franciscan family includes the Franciscan friars, the Poor Clares, the Third Order Franciscans. Millions of people around the world are inspired by Francis's message. His life reminds humanity of something deeply important: that true wealth is not found in possessions. True greatness is found in humility, love, and trust in God. Saint Francis showed that a person who owns nothing can still change the world. And more than 800 years later, the voice of the poor man of Assisi still echoes across the world. A voice that says, "Live simply, love deeply, trust God completely,